Today I want to talk about the situation between the United States and Venezuela. What is going on? What is the truth? What is the lie? If you look on English language videos here on YouTube, you will find a lot of basically ignorant people opining on this topic. What is missing often, or almost always, in the English language video is an understanding of Venezuela. They tend to view this entirely from the point of view of the United States, and often not even that, but from an outside view, full of prejudice. So, let's look at what's really going on. I lived many years in Little Venezuela, in Miami. There, what you find is a population that has fled dictatorship. And in Miami, the majority of the people, I would say, have fled dictatorship in Latin America. Spanish is the majority language, and basically everyone understands the value of liberty. When Bill Clinton went to his first election, his slogan was, "It's the economy, stupid." But in Miami, I would argue that the slogan that gets to the people is, "It's the liberty, stupid." It's not the economy. The economy is secondary. It's the liberty that's the most important. In Miami, the majority are registered Democrats, but the majority of the elected House representatives are Republican because of gerrymandering. And unfortunately, the Democratic Party has not understood the Latin community in the United States. The Democratic Party sees the Latin community as people who have come in order to make money for economical reasons. And that is true about a lot of people who come out from the Mexican border. But it's not true in Miami. People come to Miami because they flee dictatorships. For them, liberty is the most important. And that is why a significant number of them traditionally have voted for the Republican, even if they may be at heart more aligned with the Democratic Party. They have seen that the Democratic Party in the White House have not stood up for liberty and democracy in the world, especially not in Latin America. And that is the reason why so many in Miami have voted for a Republican presidential candidate. And that has shifted the balance in all of the state of Florida. And Florida is a swing state. So it could have cost the Democrats the national election because they have not understood the importance that the topic of liberty and democracy is for the Latino community in Miami. I've been saying this to the Democratic Party for a long time, but it seems to fall on deaf ears. And now the chicken have come home to roost. Because now democracy is threatened in the United States. We have an authoritarian president, an openly authoritarian president in Donald Trump. And Trump is alleging that the Democrats stole the election in 2020. There is no proof of that. But let's be clear what's going on here. They are saying, the Trump team, that in the US there is a similar system in many states for counting the votes as in Venezuela. And we know for a fact that in Venezuela that system has been used to steal the elections. And this information from Venezuela has got to the Trump campaign through the Venezuelans in the United States. And they have been led to believe that the Democrats have been using this to steal the elections because the Democrats are to the left of the Republicans. And it's easy to think that left is behaving the same way everywhere. But my experience is that that's not the case. What we have are authoritarians versus democratically minded people. Those who are for the rule of law and democracy, and those who are for autocracy. And that does not follow the left-right scale. So what's been shown recently, in recent months, by a coalition of people who call themselves, I think it's ETA, but I forgot what it stands for, have shown that in all 7 swing states in the United States, in the last election, 2024, there are irregularities in the vote counting of the same kind as was seen in a lot of elections in Venezuela. But they're not favoring the Democrat, they are favoring the Republican candidate. And the other thing I would like to mention is that when Donald Trump went for election the first time in 2016, I had been following the election campaigns in Venezuela then for a number of years. And I immediately noticed that his campaign was very similar. His messaging, his way of presenting himself, it was extremely similar to Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela. That does not mean that they are aligned. But it seems to me it means that they are using either the same or completely aligned political consultants. And I say consultants very loosely here, because it seems that who are behind this is actually Russia. And maybe Cuba, because they are waging a disinformation campaign on social media and also other media, but mostly social media. And the way the presidential candidate presents himself with a lot of confidence, saying stupid things, acting foolishly. There is no limit to the amount of stupidity in his presentation, and even so, he's acting as he is assured victory. And when I noticed that Trump was acting in that way, which Maduro did in 2013, I started to see here's a similarity. There's a significant risk that Trump will win, and he did win, in quotation marks. So there I saw this similarity. It could be that they're using the same political consultants. There are groups, like in Colombia, who work with manipulating social media for money, and it could be that they have been involved both in the campaign of Maduro and in Trump. So it does not mean that they are aligned in any way. It just means that they're using the same resources, groups, people, consultants, whatever, for the campaign. And since we know that Maduro cheated in the election fraud, electronic election fraud, it's legitimate to suspect that Trump also did that. And as I said, ETA has now presented statistical data from 7 states that show a big probability that there was election fraud in all those swing states in the 2024 election, including Florida. And at least in some of them, in a sufficient number of states, the proven or the made probable size of this election fraud is so big that it would have changed the outcome. So therefore, we can no longer say with confidence that the United States remains a democracy. And the United States has been the beacon of liberty and democracy for a couple of centuries. This whole era of democracy that we are seeing now in the world after the Middle Ages is based on the US democracy, and that is now in question. So we are in a very, very serious situation. And it's up for Europe, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and other democracies to take up this torch. But we are in precarious times, really. Now, the topic was the United States and Venezuela. I made a big detour here to say that things are not always what they seem to be. And there have been mistakes made, I would argue, in the United States, because Democrats, and I'm not talking about the people now, the party now, I'm talking about Democrats with small d, have to, by the way the system works, assume that people are following the rules. And that is what puts democracy at risk, because an autocrat can follow the rules and get into power, and by acting faster than the wheels of democracy turn, especially the wheels of justice, he can stay ahead and overturn the system. And that's what they did in Venezuela, and that's Trump's plan for the United States, by going very quickly. And also by corrupting the Supreme Court, something that was done both in Venezuela and in the United States. So that's where we are. Now, what about the situation now between the United States and Venezuela? Well, the United States Donald Trump expresses that he's going after drug smugglers. And a lot of people are saying, oh, Venezuela doesn't smuggle drugs. That's a lie. Venezuela is the main smuggler of cocaine. It's a main hub of cocaine. But most of that cocaine that goes through Venezuela probably goes to Europe and the rest of the world. Part of it goes to the United States. But if we look at the cocaine that comes to the United States, a significant part of that comes from Western Colombia. But all of the cocaine grown in Eastern Colombia is, well, basically most of it, probably all of it, is going to Venezuela. The biggest cocaine growing district in the world is Catatumbo in Colombia, which is right up to the border of Venezuela. And effectively, it's territory that Colombia has ceded to Venezuela. So it's grown on the Colombian side of the border, guarded by Colombian militaries, cooperating with the narco guerrilla, and then transported to Venezuela. We have so much information about this in the Venezuelan resistance that I can state that for a fact, and I've been there. So that is a fact. Those who deny that are speaking against better knowledge. However, what Trump is saying does not make sense. But on the other hand, when did Trump say anything that makes sense? We can't expect Trump to say things that make sense. He's just blurting out things that he picks up and hears. So, who is really behind this politics? Well, it can't very well be Pete Hegseth. There is only one person who can be behind this politics in this government of Donald Trump, and that is Marco Rubio, who, to be sure, was my congressman in Tallahassee when he lived in Hialeah, and he has been senator for Florida. So all the years I lived in the United States, I had Marco Rubio as an elected representative somewhere. So I know pretty much about him. Obviously, he is the son of Cuban immigrants, and his main goal is surely the liberation of Cuba. Cuba is living on Venezuela. Cuba is like a vampire, sucking force from Venezuela, depriving the Venezuelan, which was a very rich country, depriving the Venezuelan people of their wealth in order to sustain the dictatorship in Havana, Cuba. So to get to Cuba, to make an effective embargo on Cuba or blockade on Cuba, one has to stop the flow of resources from Venezuela, most important of which is the oil. So now maybe you can figure out why they seize oil tankers going from Venezuela to Cuba. Now, Cuba, as I said earlier in another video, was one of two communist regimes that survived the fall of the Warsaw Pact and the communist Second World. And then they spread by taking over Venezuela. They've also taken over Nicaragua now. So the permanent autocracies in the Western Hemisphere are Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua. Then there are also some other where they have got their person into the presidential office, like Honduras, Ecuador, but in subsequent elections, that person has been voted out. But Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua are now permanent dictatorships, subject to Havana, Cuba, which in turn is subject to Moscow, Russia, and allied with Iran and previously Syria and Libya before those dictators were overthrown. And also obviously allied with North Korea. And pretty close to China. But China is a case of its own. So these are really in the Russian sphere of interest. Russia is the top mafia boss, so to say, in this transnational criminal organization. And in the Americas, as I said, the problem countries are Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua. Cuba is the one who stands for the intelligence, the security. Cuban security is controlling Venezuela, controlling Maduro. And that is why when the people in Venezuela were protesting, nonviolent protest, which was met with deadly force, and it escalated to the point that the regime had to resort to genocide by starvation, Holodomor, in order to quell this uprising. And that is what provoked the exodus of now 8 million people, which converted the genocide into an ethnic cleansing. So the Venezuelan regime, which is a puppet regime of Havana, Cuba, are committing crimes against humanity, genocide, ethnic cleansing. And it's an illegitimate regime because they accepted to go to elections in 2024 and they lost, but they refused to cede power. They refused to acknowledge that they lost. But they lost. The opposition candidate, Edmundo González Urrutia, got 67% of the vote that the opposition could count. They didn't get all the ballots. And then a lot of people were prevented from voting because, as I said, 8 million had fled the country. That means that there were millions and millions of voters outside of Venezuela who obviously would have voted for the opposition candidate because they fled the dictatorship and they were prevented from voting. And even so, the opposition candidate got 67% of the votes. If we make a realistic estimate of how big a percentage of the population really is against the dictatorship, it's at least 80%. So this regime is illegitimate by any measure. And it's doing large-scale cocaine trafficking, crimes against humanity, genocide, and they're supporting terrorism. They supported the Hamas group in Gaza when they did the attack on Israel, killing more than 1,000 people, I forgot the number, and starting this atrocity down there in Gaza. That was the Maduro regime in Venezuela who supported them financially. And they support Hezbollah in Lebanon. So this is a criminal regime, a narco-terrorist regime committing crimes against humanity, genocide, ethnic cleansing. I mean, you can't very well get a less legitimate, more criminal, more horrible regime than that of Nicolás Maduro. And it's not even domestic, because it's controlled by Cuba. It's a Cuban colonial regime. So there is no doubt whatsoever that that regime should not be in control of Caracas, Venezuela. So why is it? There is something called responsibility to protect. And that is an agreement, R2P, it's abbreviated, that was made in the United Nations that the countries of the world should protect people where the government is committing genocide. And that they refused to do that in the case of Venezuela. The Venezuelan people asked them to, and they refused. So now the chicken have come home to roost. Democracies did not stand up for the Venezuelan people. The Venezuelan people have been waging a fight for a quarter of a century, a non-violent struggle for a quarter of a century for freedom and democracy and against crimes against humanity. And the world democracies have turned a blind eye. And now some even are saying, but Maduro is the president, we can't touch him, national sovereignty. That is the Russian propaganda, the Russian-Cuban propaganda speaking. The problem here is, I repeat, the democracies of the world have failed to protect a democratic people in the face of foreign influence, criminal groups, crimes against humanity. And that has opened the door. The democracies have left this thing on the table for Donald Trump to come in and grab and make that his flag. So Donald Trump has been able to take this cause and make it his because the democracies failed their responsibility. And where have we seen this movie before? We have seen this movie before in Europe in the 1930s. When Stalin committed a Holodomor in Ukraine and the democracies did nothing. Bueno, they didn't do nothing. They spoke. They raised their voices in the precursor of the United Nations. But they didn't do anything concretely to save the people of Ukraine. And then Hitler made that his flag. He took up the cause. And when Stalin attacked Finland, Hitler offered to help Finland. So when democracies do not stand up for freedom and democracy, they leave the door open. They leave the topic on the table for another autocrat to come and take up that and make himself the hero in the eyes of the people. So Trump now is the hero in the eyes of the Venezuelan people because he is the only one who acts to help them to defend their democracy. What an irony, isn't it? And that is the fault of the Democrats. It's the fault of the Democrats. And when I say Democrats, I mean both with a small d and with a big D. The Democrats in the United States have failed, but not just the Democrats, also Trump won. Because when this genocide was taking place in Venezuela, Donald Trump was president. And the first time he was president, he failed to act, as John Bolton has written in his book. So I wouldn't say that Donald Trump in any way, shape or form is a hero in this. He's just taking advantage of a failure on the part of the democracies in the world and of him himself. He's just acting in self-interest. And in this situation, we who are for liberal democracy, it's our responsibility to understand that we must act. And that is why I have proposed already in 2017 that we have to create a Venezuelan peacekeeping force, train the Venezuelans like Sweden trained resistance fighters from Denmark and Norway who fled during World War II. Sweden trained them to be able to go back to their countries and restore order the day the dictatorship, the occupation, stopped. And that's what we have to do in the case of Venezuela. And I would argue that we should set up a training facility for that. For many countries, for all the countries that are not democracies and where people are actively fighting, because no people can defeat a dictatorship that is prepared to do genocide and crimes against humanity. No people can defeat that in a non-violent struggle. It does not work. There has to be force behind the words. No amount of beautiful speeches in the UN Security Council can make an autocracy change its mind if it's not backed up by the threat of force. Peace comes through being better armed. And we have to realize that. Being armed does not bring war. On the opposite, when we, the democracies, the liberal democracies, are armed, we bring peace and stability to the world. And that applies also to the people in countries where the democracy is failing and becoming autocracies now. So with that, I will stop this video because it's already getting quite long. But please subscribe, put on notifications, because I will continue to talk about this extremely important topic. We have to save freedom. Freedom is on the line. Thank you.